Emberly Welsh had never considered herself the type of person who found excitement in wealth or social status. For her, true happiness lay in ordinary pleasures, sipping a strong cup of coffee at dawn, listening to a new melody from a street musician, or discovering an art piece that unexpectedly resonated in her soul. She lived in a modest apartment on the outskirts of New York City, far from the glitz and glamour that seemed to define many people's dreams. Yet, she was content with her simple life and her job at a small but reputable art gallery, where she curated exhibits, welcomed visitors, and sometimes even helped set up entire installations when deadlines loomed. That particular morning, everything felt slightly off. The air was thick and humid despite it being early spring, and Emberly's alarm clock hadn't gone off at its usual time. Rushing through her apartment, she clutched the handle of her coffee mug, burned her lip on the first scalding sip, and nearly tripped over a paint can she used for weekend craft projects. She managed to hail a taxi in the nick of time, mentally preparing herself for the complaints she'd hear about being a little late. Her boss, Cassiopeia Brody, was known for her dramatic flair. Cassiopeia liked to say she had the soul of a poet and the discipline of a military general, which meant her staff had to be punctual, or else face her endless scolding. When Emberly finally arrived, she was surprised by the unusual tension in the gallery. The lights were brighter than usual, shining over unfinished displays of sculptures and paintings stacked against the walls. Cassiopeia was pacing near the entrance, phone in hand, expression tight with irritation. The moment she caught sight of Emberly, she pointed a manicured finger in her direction and raised her voice. "Where have you been?" Cassiopeia demanded, though she barely paused long enough for Emberly to respond. "We just got news that a major VIP guest is coming, today. He's apparently very important, and there's talk about a huge investment in our next exhibit. I need you to help set up that new show in the main hall and make sure everything is perfect." Emberly began to apologize, but Cassiopeia cut her off with a sigh. "We have 1 hour, maybe less, before he arrives. The last thing we need is for him to walk in and see mismatched frames and blank walls." With that, Cassiopeia turned on her heel, muttering something about making sure catering had arrived and that the public relations intern had her press packets ready. Despite the chaos, Emberly felt an odd sense of calm settle over her. She had a knack for pulling things together under pressure. She immediately began rearranging sculptures, setting up information plaques, and making sure each painting was angled just right under the gallery's track lighting. In those frantic moments, she forgot to wonder about the identity of this so-called important visitor. Rumors circulated among staff that he was some notable businessman or philanthropist, but Emberly had no time to dwell on hearsay. By the time she finished straightening a final canvas, she heard the hushed buzz of activity near the entrance. People were moving aside, and Cassiopeia's voice had softened into an almost reverent tone. Whoever the VIP was, he had arrived, and he was clearly commanding attention. Emberly, fully focused on her task, barely noticed him enter the gallery, but a sense of heightened energy made her pause. She turned around and saw a tall man in a sharply tailored suit approaching her section. He walked with effortless confidence, his gaze skimming over the artwork with genuine curiosity rather than the bored detachment she had come to expect from some wealthy donors. She found herself a bit caught off guard, not least because he looked different from how she imagined the typical corporate mogul. His jacket draped elegantly over his shoulders, his expression was engaged, and there was a hint of softness in his eyes that suggested a sincere interest in what he was seeing. Without overthinking it, Emberly stepped forward, extending her hand in a polite gesture. "Welcome to the gallery," she said. Her voice came out steady and warm. She didn't know why, but despite his very refined appearance, she felt no intimidation. Instead, she sensed she was dealing with someone who truly valued creativity. He took her hand, giving it a firm but polite shake. "Thank you. I'm Lincoln Slade," he said. "I've heard impressive things about this place." Something in his tone resonated with her. He spoke as though art genuinely mattered to him, not merely as a financial investment or status symbol. She noticed how his gaze lingered on a sculpture she'd just finished positioning, a piece crafted from twisted metal and reclaimed wood. Its theme was fragmentation and the reinvention of everyday objects into something abstract and evocative. Interesting, Lincoln remarked, nodding toward the sculpture. It looks like a tangible representation of a fractured reality, the way the pieces seem on the verge of breaking apart but are held together by a single thread of metal. The precision of his observation surprised her. It was rare for visitors, especially wealthy ones, to grasp the underlying message without some sort of guided explanation. She felt a flicker of admiration for this stranger who appreciated nuance. Before she could respond, Cassiopeia materialized at Lincoln's side, all smiles and strategic charm. She offered to show him the rest of the exhibit, praising the gallery's upcoming plans and potential expansions. Emberly, suddenly pushed into the background, retreated to her tasks, but she couldn't help watching from a distance as Lincoln interacted with the gallery staff. He was polite yet firm, confident but not overtly arrogant. It was an unusual mix that piqued her curiosity. She had nearly forgotten the incident by the time the event wrapped up later that afternoon. She was in the back office, finalizing inventory records, when Cassiopeia breezed in with an excited glint in her eye. "He wants you on the new project," Cassiopeia announced, practically vibrating with anticipation. "Lincoln Slade, do you know who he is?" "Of course you don't, you're always too engrossed in actual art to keep up with gossip. He's a billionaire investor, darling, not just some wealthy donor. Apparently, he specifically asked about the woman who arranged the current setup." "That's you, Emberly." Cassiopeia's voice rose in pitch as she continued, explaining how Lincoln Slade might want to commission private exhibits or even purchase large parts of the collection. Emberly listened, feeling a whirl of conflicting emotions. Gratitude at being recognized for her expertise mingled with confusion about why a billionaire would single her out. She wondered if perhaps she had made a favorable impression simply because she treated him as an ordinary guest, rather than an untouchable VIP. That night, long after the gallery had closed, Emberly stayed back to reorganize the storage room. She needed the familiar routine to calm her thoughts. While she carefully shelved books and neatly labeled boxes of art supplies, she replayed the day's events in her mind. The shy spark in Lincoln's eyes when he spoke about the sculpture wouldn't leave her thoughts. Neither would the gentle, confident handshake that made her heart thud a little harder than she cared to admit. She tried to dismiss it as a fleeting intrigue. He was a billionaire, after all, and she was just another gallery employee. But something within her insisted this was more than just a brief encounter. It felt like the prologue to a story that was yet to unfold, a story in which her world and his, though vastly different, might intersect in ways she couldn't yet predict. After tidying the last shelf, she turned off the lights and locked up. The city's night air greeted her with a refreshing breeze, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the soft glow of street lamps. As she walked to her car, she allowed herself a moment of daydreaming about what might lie ahead. Little did she know that this day's events were the first tremors of an upheaval in her life, one that would challenge her sense of self, stoke her passions, and lead her toward a path she never knew she was destined to take. Emberly woke the next morning feeling as though her dreams had spilled over into reality. She had spent half the night replaying the previous day's events, the urgent call from Cassiopeia, the frantic preparations at the gallery, and her unexpected conversation with Lincoln Slade. Even now, as she stood in her tiny kitchen pouring coffee into a ceramic mug she'd painted herself, she couldn't shake the memory of his intense yet thoughtful gaze. She tried to push the image aside, telling herself that millionaires and billionaires often took an interest in the arts simply to broaden their portfolios. But she couldn't ignore how genuinely intrigued he had seemed. It was as if he actually saw meaning in the sculpture, instead of merely regarding it as a commodity to be traded. She was still lost in her thoughts when her phone buzzed across the kitchen counter. Expecting it to be a friend or a gallery colleague, she answered absent-mindedly, only to hear Cassiopeia's unmistakable, urgent voice. The gallery owner never bothered with, "Good morning," or, "How are you?" She barreled into the conversation as though Emberly had been expecting her call for hours. "Tell me you're free this afternoon," Cassiopeia demanded, her voice tense but also laced with excitement. "Because I have news. Huge news." Emberly cradled the phone between her ear and shoulder as she added cream to her coffee. I might be. What's going on? You remember Lincoln Slade? Cassiopeia asked, as though there was any chance Emberly might have forgotten. He just called. Or rather, his assistant did. Apparently, he was so impressed with you yesterday that he wants to discuss commissioning a private exhibit, something about an exclusive selection of modern pieces he's been eyeing. And he specifically asked for you to come by his office to discuss the details. Emberly nearly fumbled the coffee mug in her hands. She clutched the handle more tightly, feeling a sudden swirl of nerves and curiosity. It was one thing to have a wealthy patron admire the gallery's presentation. It was another matter entirely for him to request a personal meeting so soon. She tried to keep her voice steady as she said, "I'm surprised he remembered my name." Cassiopeia responded with a short laugh, clearly in a hurry. He's not the type to forget details. This could be a huge opportunity for the gallery, and for you. Meet me here by noon so we can go over some notes, and then you can take a taxi to his office. The address is in an upscale building on Fifth Avenue. Try to dress professionally. I don't want us looking unprepared. After they hung up, Emberly stared at her reflection in the nearest window. She had never had direct dealings with a billionaire outside the gallery's controlled environment. The notion of entering his domain, an office on Fifth Avenue, made her pulse flutter. She reminded herself that this was simply business. Even if her heart gave a slight flutter at the memory of his warm handshake and his sincere interest in the sculpture, it didn't mean he regarded her with anything more than professional admiration. By the time she finished dressing in a muted gray blouse and neatly pressed slacks, her nerves had calmed to a manageable level. She arrived at the gallery to find Cassiopeia in an uncharacteristically buoyant mood, fussing over a stack of papers and promotional materials. Emberly skimmed through the documents, which included background information on several artists the gallery represented. Cassiopeia made sure Emberly understood the main points. Mr. Slade wanted an array of contemporary artworks that fit a certain theme, something modern, bold, and emotionally resonant. Emberly suspected it had more to do with the way he'd spoken about fractured reality the day before. Shortly before 1 in the afternoon, Emberly set off for Fifth Avenue, her mind oscillating between excitement and caution. The taxi ride felt both brief and endless. Manhattan's noise and chaos contrasted sharply with the sense of calm she struggled to maintain. As the cab pulled up to a sleek glass skyscraper, she realized her palms were clammy. She paid the driver, stepped out onto the sidewalk, and took a moment to breathe in the crisp air. The lobby of the building was all marble floors and high ceilings, with a monochromatic installation suspended above the reception area, a rotating sculpture of glass shards that tinkled faintly with every movement. An efficient but polite receptionist directed her to the 32nd floor. Once the elevator doors slid open, she found herself in a spacious lobby overlooking a panoramic sweep of the city. A woman in a chic black suit, who introduced herself as Lincoln's personal assistant, greeted Emberly and escorted her down a hallway lined with modern art so striking it could have been a mini-gallery in its own right. When they reached Lincoln Slade's office, Emberly was greeted by the sight of floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of Central Park. The space was immaculate yet welcoming, with understated leather furniture arranged to encourage conversation rather than intimidation. She noticed a framed art print on one wall, something she recognized as an early experimental piece by a New York-based artist who specialized in abstraction. So he truly does appreciate art, she thought, feeling a flicker of relief that this job might be genuine. Lincoln stood as soon as she stepped in. He wore a tailored navy suit with the jacket draped over his chair, sleeves rolled up slightly as though he'd been working. His posture was upright, but his expression was surprisingly relaxed. He extended a hand in greeting, and she saw the same keen warmth in his gaze from the day before. "Emberly, thanks for making time," he said, motioning for her to sit. "I hope Cassiopeia explained what I'm trying to do here. I want to create a personal collection that captures some very distinct concepts: modernity, resilience, even a hint of rebellion against conventional forms. And I'd like your help." The assistant set down a tray with bottled water and 2 porcelain cups. She left discreetly, closing the door. Emberly settled into the chair opposite Lincoln, carefully placing the folder she'd brought on the table. She gave me an overview, but I'd love to hear what you have in mind directly from you. I'm flattered that you think I'm qualified. Lincoln offered a wry half-smile. Don't be modest. You displayed an immediate passion for the art in your gallery yesterday. You see the work for what it is, not just as something to sell. That's what I need, someone who values genuine expression. She could feel her cheeks warming, but she kept her tone professional. What sort of timeline do you have in mind? Acquiring rare or avant-garde pieces can take a while, depending on the artist and the budget. For the next hour, the conversation flowed from specific artists and auction houses to Emberly's insights on emerging creators whose work hadn't yet saturated the market. Lincoln asked questions that revealed a depth of knowledge she wouldn't have expected from a business magnate. He seemed less concerned about the price tags and more about the emotional punch each piece could deliver. The more they talked, the more Emberly felt her initial wariness ebb away. It wasn't until the meeting began to wind down that Emberly noticed how thoroughly time had slipped by. Her coffee had grown cold, and the sunlight streaming through the windows had shifted its angle considerably. Lincoln leaned back in his chair, hands folded in his lap, giving her a thoughtful look. You know, he said, I find it remarkable how the right painting or sculpture can speak to us on a deeply personal level. It's like a conversation, silent but powerful. I suppose that's what draws me to art in the first place. Emberly nodded, feeling more comfortable than she'd expected. Art can reveal truths we don't always put into words. That's what's so captivating about it, you either feel it, or you don't. She was about to pack up her notes when Lincoln cleared his throat. If it's not too forward, would you be interested in having dinner tonight? We could continue discussing some of these ideas without the formality of an office. Her pulse quickened. She wondered if she should politely decline. This was, after all, a professional relationship, and she hardly knew him. But something about the earnest way he asked made her hesitate. Perhaps it was the excitement she felt at the thought of talking about art in a more relaxed setting. Or maybe it was her curiosity about the man behind the suit, the one who seemed to have an honest fascination with creativity. She agreed, though she told herself she was doing so primarily in the interest of finalizing details about his private exhibit. Lincoln's assistant quickly appeared to confirm a reservation at an exclusive restaurant, and Emberly realized that slipping into his world, of personal drivers, high-end venues, and plush surroundings, might be like stepping into an entirely new life. Yet, beneath the polished veneer, she sensed a genuine connection forming. As she left the building, riding the elevator back to the bustling streets below, she found herself daydreaming about the dinner ahead. She couldn't recall the last time someone had sparked her excitement just by talking about art and its deeper resonances. Something told her that this was only the beginning, a prologue to a story that would grow more intense with each new encounter. And even though a small voice in the back of her mind whispered words of caution about mixing business and personal interests, she couldn't shake the hopeful flutter in her chest. By the time she stepped onto Fifth Avenue, the sun had dipped toward the horizon, painting the skyscrapers in shades of gold and pink. Emberly hailed a taxi, letting the door slam shut as she sank into the worn leather seat. The city rolled by in a blur of lights and honking horns, but her thoughts were far from the immediate traffic. She felt like she was standing on the edge of something important, something that might reshape the course of her life. Despite her usual inclinations toward caution, she couldn't help anticipating what would happen when she next crossed paths with Lincoln Slade, both professionally and, perhaps, in a realm even more uncertain. Emberly spent the hours before dinner in a tug-of-war between excitement and nerves. After returning to her apartment, she barely had time to shower and change before she needed to head out again, this time to an upscale restaurant recommended by Lincoln's assistant. The setting was far beyond anywhere she usually dined. From what she'd been told, it boasted velvet seating and a private terrace overlooking a tranquil courtyard. She chose a sleek black dress that felt just polished enough to be professional, yet still reflected her own sense of style with its subtle artistic design on the sleeves. As she walked out the door, she caught a glimpse of her own reflection in the hallway mirror, there was a flush on her cheeks that she couldn't entirely blame on the summer heat lingering in the air. When she arrived at the restaurant, the maitre d' greeted her by name, as though she were someone of significance. He politely informed her that Mr. Slade was already waiting, then escorted her down a corridor of glass panels showcasing bottles of rare wines. Each step made Emberly acutely aware of the exclusivity of this place, the low hum of hushed conversations, the gentle tinkle of silverware, and the glimmer of candlelight all signaled a world she'd only glimpsed from a distance. A part of her felt slightly out of place, but she reminded herself that she was here to discuss art, an area in which she felt at home, no matter the surroundings. Lincoln rose from the table as soon as he spotted her, a courteous gesture that left her momentarily breathless. He'd shed his suit jacket in favor of a tailored vest, his sleeves rolled just enough to appear more relaxed than he had in his office. Still, he exuded a quiet confidence that made him stand out among the other patrons. Emberly hesitated for a fraction of a second before approaching, but his welcoming smile eased her nerves. When he pulled out her chair, she caught a subtle whiff of his cologne, something cool and clean, like fresh citrus with an undercurrent of spice. "I'm glad you made it," Lincoln said once they were both seated. The host stepped forward to pour water into their glasses, and Emberly took a moment to soak in the ambient glow of the restaurant's softly lit chandelier. "I was worried my assistant's message might have been too abrupt." Emberly offered a small laugh, folding her hands in her lap. "I was surprised, but in a good way. Normally, meetings about private collections happen in offices or galleries, not candlelit restaurants." He acknowledged her point with a slight nod. "True, but I feel like art isn't something that should be confined by stiff formality. I want to get a sense of your perspective in a more relaxed environment." He paused, studying her as if to gauge her reaction. "And if I'm honest, I think you and I have more to discuss than just paintings and sculpture." She felt a slight flutter in her chest at his words, but she focused on the practical side of their meeting. "Cassiopeia told me you're looking for very specific pieces, something thematic, with a modern yet emotionally resonant feel. I brought a few catalogs on my phone to show you some possibilities." Lincoln leaned forward, resting his elbows lightly on the white tablecloth. "I'm definitely interested in seeing your suggestions, but perhaps we can wait until after we order. Let's take a moment to unwind. Art should be appreciated with a clear mind, or at least without the distraction of an empty stomach." Emberly agreed, realizing only now how hungry she was. A waiter approached with menus, and as she glanced through the list of dishes, each name more elaborate than the last, Lincoln recommended a particular seafood entree he'd enjoyed previously. When she admitted she wasn't very familiar with high-end culinary choices, he reassured her that the chef often prepared simpler variations to accommodate different tastes. The brief exchange felt intimate, as though they were two ordinary people figuring out dinner, rather than a billionaire investor and a gallery specialist. Once they placed their orders, the conversation shifted to more personal terrain. Emberly found herself asking about his background, where he developed such a deep appreciation for art, why he chose to invest in culture rather than, say, the tech world. Lincoln explained that while his main enterprises did involve technology and real estate, his late mother had been an avid patron of the arts. She was the one who took him to his first gallery at age 10, pointing out brushstrokes and color palettes, teaching him to look beneath the surface of each piece. When she passed away, art became his way of remembering her influence and continuing a connection he still craved. Hearing this, Emberly felt an unexpected tightness in her chest. The tenderness with which he spoke made him seem more vulnerable, less the iron-willed businessman she'd glimpsed in the office. She confessed that she'd fallen in love with art almost by accident, stumbling into a part-time gallery job during college and discovering she had a gift for interpreting the meaning behind installations and paintings. Over time, that part-time gig became her passion, and she'd never looked back, despite her friends advising her to chase more lucrative careers. By the time their entrees arrived, the awkwardness Emberly had initially felt began to dissolve. Over forkfuls of exquisitely prepared fish, they discussed the merits of abstract art, the challenges of finding truly original talent, and their mutual disdain for how some art collectors cared only for resale value. At one point, Lincoln asked her about the piece she'd most like to acquire if money were no object. She laughed and described a rare sculpture made of compressed textiles and resin, a piece that almost looked alive, with its folds and creases. It was on a hidden market, barely discussed but deeply coveted by those who knew its story. He listened attentively, as though memorizing every detail, and she couldn't help but wonder if he might just procure it, if only to see her astonished reaction. When the plates were cleared, Emberly finally pulled out her phone to show him the digital portfolios she had compiled. Each artist she highlighted had a distinct edge, some toyed with multimedia installations, others played with surreal imagery that challenged viewers to question their own perceptions. Lincoln seemed enthralled by her descriptions, tapping the screen to enlarge certain images and make notes on which pieces he felt most resonated with his intended theme. More than once, his gaze flickered upward from the device to linger on her face, as though watching her explain the art was as captivating as the pieces themselves. The dessert course arrived, an intricately plated array of chocolate and fruit that looked almost too beautiful to eat. Emberly tried to focus on finishing her presentation, but she found her own attention drifting. She couldn't ignore the atmosphere, the lull of refined conversation around them, the aroma of decadent sweetness, and the awareness of Lincoln's unwavering attention. At one point, their eyes met, and something unsaid yet powerful seemed to pass between them. "Do you ever worry," she asked softly, setting aside her phone, "that when people hear you're a billionaire, they only see you as a source of money for their ambitions?" A faint shadow crossed his features. "All the time," he admitted. "That's why it's been so refreshing talking to you. From the moment we met at the gallery, it felt like you saw the art first, and me second. Most people do the opposite." Emberly understood more than she cared to admit. Her own experiences were far less extravagant, but she'd met her share of patrons who saw her as a means to their own ends. "It's hard to find genuine connections," she replied, swirling her spoon through the delicate chocolate sauce on her plate. "But that's also what I love about art. It's a universal language. It doesn't care if you're wealthy or not, it speaks to anyone who's open enough to listen." Their conversation stretched longer than Emberly realized. By the time the waiter gently informed them that closing time was near, she felt a mild flush of embarrassment for monopolizing the table. Lincoln handled the check with minimal fuss, though she noticed him slip an impressively generous tip under the edge of the billfold. As they stepped outside, the cool night air hit her, and she realized how much the evening had felt like a dream. The dark sky was studded with stars barely visible through the city's light pollution, and her heart pounded in an unsteady rhythm she couldn't fully explain. Lincoln offered to have his driver take her home, but she declined, suggesting instead that she'd like to walk a few blocks to clear her head. He walked with her, at least for a short stretch, until they stood at a quiet intersection beneath the soft glow of a lamppost. There was a moment of hesitation, a slight tension that felt simultaneously warm and uncertain. Emberly wondered if he might lean in, but he simply smiled, thanked her for sharing the evening with him, and wished her a safe night. As she watched his car pull away, Emberly felt a swirl of emotions that went beyond the excitement of a potential professional collaboration. In the span of a few hours, she'd seen facets of Lincoln's Slade that both fascinated her and set her guard up. She realized that what lay ahead wasn't just a project to curate exclusive artworks. It was a path that could converge their worlds in unexpected ways, challenging her to reconcile the quiet life she'd cherished with the exhilarating, but potentially perilous, influence of his. The thought simultaneously thrilled and unsettled her, and for the first time in years, she found herself truly wondering where this path would lead and whether she was ready for the challenges it might bring. Over the next few days, Emberly found herself caught in a peculiar haze of anticipation and self-questioning. She pored over digital art catalogs and made calls to obscure studios on behalf of Lincoln's proposed collection, yet she couldn't help replaying the last moments of their dinner in her mind. She could still feel the gentle brush of the evening air on her skin, the soft glow of the city lights reflecting in his eyes, and the faint tension between them that never quite resolved into anything definitive. The memory lingered, filling her with equal parts warmth and uncertainty. She tried to maintain her usual routines, forcing herself to focus on the concrete tasks of her job, reorganizing display spaces at the gallery, fielding inquiries from prospective buyers, and updating social media profiles for upcoming exhibits. But every so often, she would pause, her hands hovering over a keyboard or her gaze drifting away from a painting. A quiet voice in her head asked whether this connection with Lincoln was a temporary fascination or something that could alter the course of her life. She reminded herself that she had only just begun working on his commission. It was too soon to be daydreaming about anything else. On a Thursday afternoon, Cassiopeia stopped by Emberly's small office at the gallery with news that made Emberly's heart skip a beat. An exclusive arts event was scheduled for that weekend, a private preview of an upcoming auction with pieces so rare that only the most elite collectors were invited. Cassiopeia looked both exultant and frazzled as she stepped inside and planted her hands on Emberly's desk. "Lincoln Slade wants you to attend," Cassiopeia announced without preamble. "He called me personally to insist you go with him to see if there's anything suitable for his collection. I'm sure you realize what a huge opportunity this is for our gallery's reputation." Emberly felt a ripple of excitement swirl through her, though she fought to maintain a professional facade. She nodded, carefully keeping her voice steady. "I've heard rumors about that event. Apparently, they're featuring some pieces by a reclusive sculptor whose work rarely surfaces on the open market. It might be a perfect fit for Lincoln's vision." "That's what he's hoping," Cassiopeia confirmed, her gaze flicking across Emberly's face. "But listen, this is your chance to really prove yourself. If you can help him find something spectacular, it'll put us on the map in a way we haven't been before." She hesitated for a moment, then leaned in closer. "Just be careful, all right? It's easy to get swept up in that world. These collectors can be very demanding." Emberly appreciated the concern in Cassiopeia's tone, even if she suspected her boss was hinting at the murkiness of mixing business with personal sentiments. She nodded again, promising she'd stay focused. Yet deep down, she knew the lines in her relationship with Lincoln were already starting to blur. When Saturday arrived, Emberly dressed with painstaking care, choosing a charcoal gray ensemble that felt sophisticated without edging into ostentation. She spent longer than usual on her hair, eventually pinning it up to showcase a pair of small sapphire earrings she rarely wore. Stepping outside her apartment, she was greeted by a town car Lincoln had sent, and she settled into the back seat, gripping the strap of her purse to keep her restless hands occupied. The trip felt like a short eternity. She busied herself by reviewing photos of the rumored pieces that might appear at the auction, mentally matching them with the themes Lincoln had told her he wanted to explore in his personal collection. Arriving at the venue, a discreet mansion in an affluent neighborhood just outside the city, Emberly was struck by the understated elegance of the place. It had the grandeur of old money, with a tall iron gate and meticulously trimmed hedges, yet no garish signs or red carpet signaled the exclusivity of the gathering. A valet opened the car door, and the faint murmur of conversation drifted from inside, where guests were already mingling over champagne and hors d'oeuvres. She spotted Lincoln near an ornate marble fountain in the entrance hall. He looked sharply handsome in a dark suit, but she caught a flicker of relief in his eyes when he saw her, as though he'd been waiting. He offered a small smile. "I'm glad you're here. Ready to dive into the madness?" She exhaled in a quiet laugh, stepping closer. "Ready as I'll ever be. Do we have a plan, or are we just going to wander and hope something catches our eye?" Lincoln gestured for her to walk with him toward a corridor where the art was being displayed in individual, meticulously lit rooms. "A little of both. I got a partial list of the lots, but some of them are intentionally hidden until they decide if they'll go up for auction. We'll have to keep our eyes open." They moved through the rooms side by side, pausing at sculptures fashioned from gleaming metals and canvases thick with expressive brushstrokes. Emberly was struck by the hush that fell whenever they approached a piece that truly commanded attention. She could sense his growing excitement each time they encountered something potentially suitable for his collection. He asked pointed questions about an artist's background or technique, surprising her again with the depth of his knowledge. At one display, they found a painting that seemed to mirror a tumultuous inner landscape. Fiery swirls of crimson and gold clashed with jagged lines of black. Emberly explained the artist's reputation for capturing human conflict through abstract forms, and Lincoln studied it with a faint furrow between his brows. After a moment, he turned to her. "You've mentioned you're drawn to pieces that evoke strong emotion," he said thoughtfully. "Would you want something like this in your own home?" She hesitated, considering the rawness of the work. "It's powerful, but I don't know if I could see it every day. It's almost too intense, like it demands confrontation rather than offering comfort. I think it belongs somewhere people are ready to face the darker sides of themselves." He nodded, quietly absorbing her words. "And are you ready to face yours?" The question hung in the air, surprisingly personal. Emberly looked up at him, feeling a subtle tension ripple between them. A quip about being prepared for anything came to her lips, but she didn't utter it. Instead, she answered honestly. "I'm not sure. But if art can help bring it out, maybe that's better than pretending it doesn't exist." Lincoln's gaze lingered on her for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, and it felt as though he'd asked that question not just about the painting, but also about whatever was brewing between them. Their exchange was cut short by the arrival of a silver-haired woman who introduced herself as one of the event's coordinators. She greeted Lincoln with effusive politeness, ushering them toward a set of closed doors that supposedly led to the most exclusive pieces of the evening. Inside, the space was darker, quieter. Pockets of warm light illuminated sculptures of stone and wood, each standing on its own low pedestal. The hush in the room was tangible, as though every visitor felt the gravity of the creations on display. Emberly inhaled sharply when she saw a piece she recognized from whispered art circles, a sinuous sculpture carved from driftwood and polished to reveal the grain's intricate patterns. It had been rumored to exist, but she never dreamed she'd see it in person. Lincoln must have noted her expression, because he leaned in. "Is this one you've heard about?" She nodded, stepping closer. The sculpture depicted two halves of a human figure twisting apart, yet the wood's natural curves implied they were still connected at some unbreakable core. "It's rumored to be created by a reclusive artist who rarely sells. Collectors have been searching for it for years." They exchanged a look, and for a fleeting moment, Emberly felt as though time slowed. This was precisely why they were here, the thrill of discovery, the electric sense that art could reveal something profound and essential about the human experience. She saw the spark of triumph in Lincoln's eyes, and she realized this sculpture might be the key piece he'd been seeking to represent the fusion of defiance and hope he wanted in his personal collection. Before she could say more, another collector strolled over, eyeing the sculpture with obvious interest. The unspoken competition crackled in the air. Lincoln touched Emberly's elbow lightly, steering her away with a purposeful nod. Later, they would strategize about how best to secure this piece. For now, they simply shared the rush of possibility. As they continued through the exhibit, Emberly felt her pulse thrum with excitement. She realized it wasn't just the art that made her heart pound. It was the sense that something real and unpredictable was taking shape between her and Lincoln, a connection forged by shared passions and an undeniable pull toward each other. The idea both thrilled and frightened her. Yet she had the distinct sense that whatever happened next, she wouldn't be able to turn back. This was a world she'd always glimpsed from the periphery, and now she stood at its center, hand in hand with a man who seemed capable of challenging every boundary she'd ever set for herself. The auction had already stretched well past its scheduled hours when Emberly found herself trailing Lincoln through a side corridor of the mansion. The official part of the evening was winding down, guests leaving in chauffeured cars, staff beginning to tidy up empty champagne flutes, and the ornate hallways slowly quieting after a day of insistent chatter. Yet Lincoln seemed anything but ready to depart. He was still focused on securing the mesmerizing driftwood sculpture they had discovered earlier, pacing the corridor with a fervor that bordered on impatience. Emberly couldn't remember the last time she'd seen him so visibly on edge. His usual confidence appeared frayed, and she sensed that something deeper than mere business anxiety was at play. Ever since they'd laid eyes on that sculpture, Lincoln had spoken of its beauty in hushed, almost reverent tones. She knew he was used to getting what he wanted. After all, he was a billionaire whose name alone opened doors, but this acquisition seemed personal in a way she hadn't fully understood. At last, they reached a small room that had been set aside for private negotiations. A handful of other collectors and their representatives were engaged in hushed discussions around a large mahogany table, each group spaced a careful distance apart to maintain confidentiality. As Lincoln guided Emberly inside, she noticed how the room exuded an air of tense politeness. Even the subdued lighting seemed to emphasize each whispered deal, each subtle gesture of competition. They located the contact person, a bespectacled older man in a sharply tailored suit, who was rumored to be the intermediary for the driftwood sculpture's reclusive artist. He greeted them with a thin-lipped smile, acknowledging Lincoln with a nod and Emberly with a curious glance. When Lincoln voiced his interest in finalizing the purchase, the intermediary's expression flickered from polite neutrality to guarded wariness. "I'm afraid we've had multiple bidders come forward," he began, eyes darting around the room. "The piece has been the subject of quite a bit of attention tonight. I cannot guarantee acceptance of any offer, any final decision remains at the discretion of the artist." Lincoln's jaw tightened. "I'm aware of the competition. But I also know that money isn't the only factor here. This sculpture means something to the artist. I want to convey that I'm not just buying an expensive centerpiece, I'm prepared to display it in a setting that respects its message. Perhaps you can pass that along." Emberly watched Lincoln with a mixture of admiration and concern. His desire to emphasize the emotional connection rather than just flash his wealth reflected the side of him she respected most, the side that genuinely cared about art and its impact. But she also glimpsed the determination in his eyes, a hint of that impatient edge she had sensed in the corridor. The intermediary offered no immediate reassurance, only a non-committal promise to relay Lincoln's intentions. Then he drifted away to speak with another cluster of potential buyers. With the possibility of losing the sculpture looming, Lincoln paced toward one of the tall windows. Night had fully claimed the estate, and the manicured gardens were lit by carefully placed lamps, illuminating neat hedges and white stone pathways. Emberly moved to his side, gently placing a hand on his arm. "Sometimes you have to let art come to you," she said quietly. "Pushing too hard could alienate the seller, especially one who's known to be skittish about commercial transactions." He raked a hand through his hair, turning to face her. "I know. But I've never been good at waiting when something truly matters to me." The intensity in his gaze made her heart skip. They lingered there, side by side, with the soft din of other negotiations filling the background. She could tell he was weighing several unspoken thoughts, perhaps not just about the sculpture, but also about the tension crackling between them over these past weeks. Before either of them could speak again, a sharp voice cut through the hush. "Slade, there you are." A tall, broad-shouldered man in an expensive suit approached them, exuding the air of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Emberly recognized him as a well-known tech tycoon who had also been vying for the driftwood sculpture. She had seen him glancing at it throughout the evening with a smug kind of possessiveness that reminded her of a predator sizing up prey. Lincoln's posture shifted instantly, going rigid with an undercurrent of hostility. "Sawyer," he greeted coolly. The man's gaze flicked to Emberly, and a predatory smile curved his lips. "And you must be the gallery liaison Lincoln's been bragging about. I hear you have quite the eye for hidden gems. I've actually wondered if your persuasion skills are part of why he's so determined. Maybe you've convinced him this is the next big thing in the art world." Emberly felt a prickle of discomfort. There was an insinuating tone to his words, as if he were reducing her expertise to a mere prop in Lincoln's quest. She forced a polite smile, but didn't back down. "I wouldn't call it persuasion, just insight," she replied. "But I appreciate your interest in my opinion." Sawyer chuckled, turning his attention back to Lincoln. "A pity we're all after the same treasure. You know what they say, may the best man win." His voice dripped with a condescending challenge. Lincoln's eyes narrowed, and Emberly sensed the energy between them intensify. She realized that there was a personal rivalry here, something that extended beyond the art acquisition. Perhaps old business dealings or social grudges. Whatever it was, the tension between them felt like a live wire, ready to spark at the slightest provocation. As Sawyer ambled away, clearly pleased with the effect of his taunt, Lincoln let out a rough exhale. That man has a knack for finding out exactly what I want, then swooping in to take it if he can. It's a game to him. Emberly spoke softly, hoping to calm him. We don't have to let him get under our skin. Let's finalize the best bid we can, share your intentions with the artist, and trust the piece will end up in the hands of someone who truly respects it. It sounded so logical when she said it, yet she could feel his frustration mounting. He led her to a quieter corner of the room, near a side table adorned with decorative vases. There, they conferred about possible offers and what message to convey if they got a chance to speak directly with the reclusive artist's representative. Emberly emphasized that overshadowing everyone else with money wasn't necessarily the wisest approach, especially if the artist distrusted commercial exploitation. Lincoln, who had initially listened carefully, suddenly clenched his fists at his sides. You think I'm just throwing money around? He asked, voice tight. I'm trying to do this the right way, but I know the reality of these circles. If I don't show serious financial commitment, Sawyer will look more appealing to them. Emberly hesitated. Lincoln, I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm only saying that sincerity can sometimes matter more than extra zeros in a check. You've spent weeks telling me that's what you believe too. Did something change? A flash of temper crossed his features, surprising her. In all their prior interactions, Lincoln had been calm, intense, but rarely angry. Now, his jaw worked, and his eyes sparked with a mixture of defensiveness and impatience. Don't you see? For me, this is more than just an art deal. That sculpture, it's the perfect symbol of what I've been trying to build in my life. Two halves, bound together by something unbreakable. It resonates with me on levels I can't even fully explain. And it's slipping away because of petty rivalries and complicated, unspoken rules I don't have time for. Emberly reached for his arm again, trying to offer solace. She opened her mouth to say something reassuring, but in that moment, a well-dressed event organizer approached them, politely reminding all remaining guests that the mansion would be closing its doors within the hour. Whatever final discussions needed to happen had to happen soon. Lincoln's frustration boiled over. He pivoted, letting out a sharp breath. Emberly, we need to track down that intermediary now. I'm done waiting, he said. Without waiting for her reply, he stalked off in the direction of the largest adjoining room. Unease knotted Emberly's stomach as she hurried to follow. She caught up with him just as he found the intermediary deep in conversation with another collector. Lincoln's abrupt arrival drew startled looks, but he ignored them, his voice terse. I need a moment, please. The older man frowned, stepping away from the other collector. Mr. Slade, I told you I'd speak to the artist's representative and get back to you. Nothing has changed in the last 10 minutes. Lincoln's irritation flared visibly. I'm not leaving until we have a more definitive answer. If there's anything more I can do, anything I can say to prove how seriously I value that piece, I'll do it. The intermediary stiffened, glancing nervously at Emberly as if hoping she might intervene. She tried to place a hand on Lincoln's sleeve to pull him aside, but he brushed her off. The conversation was devolving into tense back and forth, with the intermediary repeatedly insisting they required patience and Lincoln making it clear that patience was the last thing he felt capable of. Emberly felt her own temper spike, a rare sensation. She had always prized diplomacy, but Lincoln's single-minded aggression left no room for her careful approach. She tugged harder on his arm, finally forcing his attention away from the intermediary. You're not listening, she hissed, voice taut. You're going to sabotage your own chances if you keep pushing like this. Remember who you are, you're the collector who cares, not the one who bullies people into getting what he wants. His eyes flashed indignation, and for a moment, it seemed they might argue in front of everyone. He pulled his arm free, turning on her. You think I'm bullying him? I'm just trying to cut through the dance of high society politics and make sure I'm heard. Something inside Emberly snapped. Maybe it was the stress of the late hour, or the swirl of tension filling the room, or the sting of seeing him disregard her attempts to help. In an instant, she heard her own voice rise above the murmuring crowd. "You're acting exactly like the people you claim to despise, throwing your weight around without any respect for how it affects the people around you." Lincoln's face hardened, a wounded pride flaring in his eyes. "I have to do what it takes," he shot back. "Because people like Sawyer will trample me if I don't." Unable to contain her frustration, Emberly responded with a swift, impulsive gesture she would later question 100 times. She slapped him. It wasn't a gentle tap, it was a sharp, stinging contact of her open palm against his cheek, loud enough to make a few heads turn in nearby corners. Shock pulsed through her the moment she realized what she had done, and she saw the flicker of disbelief in Lincoln's face. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then, as though spurred by an equally potent wave of emotion, whether anger, passion, or something else entirely, Lincoln closed the distance between them in 2 strides. He cupped her face in his hands, pulling her toward him in a sudden, urgent kiss. It was a confusing mix of fury and fierce tenderness, his breath ragged, his movements forceful yet controlled. Emberly found her entire body going rigid with surprise before melting into the heated moment, her mind spinning too fast to settle on any clear thought. They parted just as quickly, both of them breathing heavily, gazes locked in mutual astonishment. The slap sting still lingered on her hand, and the taste of his mouth was something she couldn't quite process. Around them, the low hum of conversation had died down, guests and staff trying politely not to stare at the spectacle. Emberly's cheeks burned in mortification and a jolt of something akin to longing, all churned together in a single heartbeat. Lincoln took a step back, running a hand over his face, as though trying to gather his shattered composure. He began, then swallowed thickly. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. I lost control." Emberly shook her head, her pulse pounding. I shouldn't have slapped you," she managed to reply, voice shaking. She was vaguely aware that the intermediary had slipped away, that the watchers were discreetly drifting to other parts of the room. They stood alone in the circle of faint overhead light, confronted by the fallout of their heated emotions. After several seconds of suffocating silence, she lowered her gaze, heartbreakingly conscious of the gulf that had opened between them in a single moment. She had struck him out of frustration and care for his better nature. He had kissed her with something as raw as anger, yet laced with the magnetic pull they'd both been dancing around. "I think we need to get out of here," Emberly said, her voice still trembling. "Everyone's watching." Lincoln nodded, his features torn between remorse and lingering shock. Gently, he touched the side of her face, where a blush still burned. "We'll talk," he said softly, then added in a voice only she could hear, "I never wanted this to happen. Not like this." Together, they made a rapid exit from the negotiation room, their abrupt departure drawing curious stares. They walked in strained silence through the corridors, past the murmuring guests who were too polite to comment directly on the scene. Emberly's mind whirled with guilt, anger, and unspoken desire, all mingling in a chaotic storm. She had come to this event hoping to help Lincoln secure a masterpiece for his collection, and somehow, the night had ended with a slap that ignited an unexpected kiss. Once outside, the fresh night air felt cool against Emberly's flushed skin. She glanced sideways at Lincoln, unsure of what to say or do. He waved off the valet who tried to greet them, leading Emberly to a secluded corner of the mansion's circular drive. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and thick with emotion. "You were right," he admitted, staring down at the gravel beneath their feet. "I was pushing too hard. I let my pride and anger get the best of me. I told you I value art for the emotion it stirs, and yet I ended up making it all about winning." The apology, raw and unguarded, made Emberly's eyes sting. She folded her arms tightly over her chest. "I'm sorry for losing my temper. That slap. I wish I could take it back." Lincoln stepped closer, gently brushing a stray curl from her face. "I don't blame you. Truthfully, it shocked me into realizing I was spiraling." He hesitated, then let out a ragged breath. "As for the kiss, I'm not sure how to justify it." A quiver ran through Emberly. She couldn't deny the swirl of conflicting emotions that had fueled that brief, fervent contact. "Me neither," she whispered. "But we can't pretend it didn't happen." For a long moment, they stood there, each trying to find solid ground after the overwhelming surge of adrenaline. The quiet hush of the estate surrounded them, distant car engines, a faint breeze rustling the hedges, and the glow of the mansion's lights. Emberly felt a pang of sadness, realizing that whatever had sparked between them had now been thrust into a glaring, complicated spotlight. Eventually, Lincoln cleared his throat. "I'll talk to the intermediary again tomorrow. Politely. And I'll do it on my own terms, without demands. Maybe we can salvage this deal without letting pride or rivalry destroy it." Emberly nodded. "Good. You still deserve a chance at that sculpture, especially if it means so much to you." He gave a weary half-smile. "Let me take you home. We should both get some rest. We'll figure out the rest of it in the morning." Accepting his offer, Emberly climbed into the waiting town car with him. They rode in near silence, broken only by hesitant half-phrases and the occasional apology. She stared out the window, watching the distant city lights shimmer in the darkness, her mind drifting between disbelief at what had just happened and the undeniable warmth that still lingered on her lips. By the time they reached her apartment building, the night had deepened into a hush that swallowed most street noises. Lincoln opened the car door for her, and she slipped out onto the curb. For a moment, she thought he might say something more, one last declaration, an attempt to reconcile the collision of anger and longing they had shared. But the words never came. Instead, he pressed his lips together in a tight line, then murmured a simple, "Good night, Emberly." She stood there, the weight of the evening pressing against her chest, and watched him sink back into the shadows of the car. The driver pulled away, the taillights disappearing into the dark. As she climbed the steps to her apartment, her hand still faintly tingled from the slap, and her heart continued to beat at a frantic pace. She knew that everything had changed in the span of a few minutes, between them, between who they both thought they were. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but she suspected that neither she nor Lincoln would be able to ignore the complicated new reality that had seized them both. The unanswered questions lingered like echoes in her mind: had she jeopardized their budding connection forever, or had they merely shattered the barrier that kept them from confronting their true feelings? Only time would reveal the answer. For now, all she could do was navigate the aftermath of a moment she couldn't erase, but perhaps, just perhaps, could learn to understand. Emberly woke the next morning with her mind still reeling from the events of the previous night. Her palm felt strangely warm, as though it remembered the sting of striking Lincoln's cheek. At the same time, her lips retained the faintest echo of the fleeting, fervent kiss they had shared. It was a confusing blend of shame, yearning, and a nagging worry that she had upended everything she and Lincoln had built, both personally and professionally. She went through the motions of her usual morning routine with mechanical detachment, brewing coffee, feeding her cat, and flipping through last night's messages. A text from Cassiopeia had arrived just after midnight, wanting details about the auction and whether Lincoln had managed to secure the driftwood sculpture. Emberly stared at her phone, torn about how much to reveal. The last thing she wanted was for her boss to learn that the evening had ended in a spectacle worthy of scandal. Yet she also knew that if word got around in art circles, as it likely would, Cassiopeia would need to be prepared for any fallout. Deciding to buy time, Emberly sent a quick reply saying she was still waiting to hear from Lincoln about the final negotiations. Not long after, her phone buzzed again, causing her to jump. This time, the name on the screen made her heart pound harder: Lincoln Slade. Hesitating only a moment, she answered, bracing herself for a continuation of the tension that had flared between them. "Emberly," he began, his tone unusually subdued. "I'm about to meet the intermediary for the sculpture. I asked him to arrange a call with the artist's representative, someone who works closely with the sculptor and can actually influence the decision. Would you be willing to join me?" She exhaled, relief and anxiety colliding in her chest. "Yes, I'll be there. Where should I meet you?" He rattled off the address of a private office building in Midtown, explaining that the artist's representative kept a small, discreet suite for such meetings. She could sense Lincoln's careful control over his voice, as though he, too, was searching for a path beyond the tumult they had unleashed the night before. Within the hour, Emberly found herself riding the elevator to a high floor with marble-tiled hallways and subdued lighting. She stepped out into a narrow corridor lined with minimalist paintings that probably cost a fortune. At the very end, a dark wooden door stood ajar, leading into a waiting room decorated with a few tasteful sculptures and plush armchairs. Lincoln was already there, seated on a sleek couch, his posture rigid as he tapped a restless rhythm on one knee. When he looked up and spotted her, he rose, unsure whether to greet her with a handshake, a nod, or something more personal. Ultimately, he settled on a polite inclination of his head, motioning for her to join him. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. She mustered a tight smile, trying not to let her gaze flicker to his cheek or his mouth. "I'm here for the same reason you are, that piece deserves an owner who respects it. Hopefully, we can convince whoever's involved that your intentions are sincere." Before Lincoln could respond, the intermediary from the previous night emerged through a frosted glass door. He looked less flustered than he had at the mansion, but his expression was still guarded as he gestured for them to follow him into a small conference room. A long table took up most of the space, with an array of documents spread out across its gleaming surface. At the head of the table sat a trim, middle-aged woman dressed in a tailored navy suit. She had graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, and her poised manner suggested a lifetime of negotiating delicate deals. "Mr. Slade." "Ms. Welsh," the woman greeted, nodding to each of them in turn. "I'm Regina Fairchild, the representative for the sculptor in question. Please, have a seat. I understand the previous evening ended," tensely. A faint blush crept up Emberly's neck, but Lincoln cleared his throat before she had to respond. "Yes, it did," he admitted. "I apologize for any disturbance that may have spilled onto your team. My frustration got the better of me, and I'm determined to rectify that. My goal is to show the artist I'm not just another collector flaunting cash. I truly connect with this piece." Regina's cool gaze flicked from Lincoln to Emberly, as though assessing how genuinely they were presenting themselves. "Passion is one thing," she said, folding her hands on the table. "Respect is another. The artist I represent values authenticity above all else. Money will always influence who can and cannot buy certain works, but sincerity and respect for the art, that's often the deciding factor for her." Emberly felt a surge of hope. "That's exactly why Lincoln was drawn to the sculpture," she said. "From the moment we saw it, it was never about just adding an expensive trophy to his collection. It was about how that piece reflects something deep and personal. And I can vouch for that." Regina arched a brow. "You can vouch for him, Ms. Welsh. Are you his advisor?" Emberly hesitated, recalling all the times she and Lincoln had pored over artworks together, discussing their emotional resonance. "I suppose you could call me that," she replied carefully. "But I'm also someone who believes certain pieces of art speak to us at a spiritual level." When he saw that sculpture, it was as though it mirrored a part of his soul. It's hard to fake that kind of reaction. A beat of silence passed in which Regina studied them both. Finally, she retrieved a small portfolio from under a leather binder and slid it across the table. "The artist asked me to present these questions to any prospective buyer who reaches the final consideration. Some of them are practical, like whether you'll loan the piece out for public exhibitions, but others are more philosophical. She believes that how you answer these will determine whether the sculpture finds its rightful home." Lincoln took the document, his jaw tight with determination. "I'll answer anything." Emberly peered over his shoulder as they skimmed the pages. The questions were indeed personal and surprising. One page asked for a reflection on what the sculpture meant in the context of the buyer's life, how it might influence daily thought, how it might shape the environment in which it was displayed. Another question asked whether the piece would ever be resold if financial markets turned. Emberly couldn't help but feel impressed that the artist would go to such lengths, ensuring that her work was honored rather than simply hoarded. They spent the next hour crafting responses, with Emberly offering suggestions and Lincoln weaving in his own heartfelt insights. The atmosphere in the small conference room was tense yet oddly intimate, every sentence laden with significance. Regina occasionally asked clarifying questions, her sharp eyes revealing a mind that missed nothing. By the time they were done, Emberly felt she had bared something of herself as well. Talking about art in such a raw, honest way inevitably revealed personal vulnerabilities. When they finally handed the completed questionnaire back to Regina, she scanned the pages briefly. "I will forward these to my client," she said, her voice neutral but not unkind. "It may take a few days for her to review everything and make a decision. I'll be in touch when there's an update." Lincoln let out a breath he hadn't seemed to realize he was holding. "Thank you," he said quietly. Emberly echoed his gratitude with a nod, feeling as though an invisible weight had lifted, at least for now. They left the office in a haze of mingled relief and apprehension, walking side by side through the hushed corridor. Emberly couldn't resist a glance in Lincoln's direction, noticing how he flexed his fingers as if to shake off lingering tension. She recognized that subtle gesture. It was the same restless energy he'd shown the night before, except now it radiated more as hope than frustration. They stopped by a bank of elevators where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the sprawling city below. Slanting sunlight caught the reflective surfaces of glass towers, and from this height, people on the street seemed as tiny as ants. Emberly turned to Lincoln, unsure if this was the moment they were supposed to talk about the slap and the kiss. The memory of it pulsed between them, too vivid to ignore for long. "Thank you for coming," Lincoln repeated, his voice softer. "I don't think I would have managed to express my motivations as clearly without you there." Emberly felt her cheeks warm. It was the right thing to do. Despite everything that happened last night. "I know your relationship with art is genuine. If it weren't, I wouldn't still be here." He nodded, gaze drifting briefly to her lips before shifting away. "About last night. I'm sorry. I wish it hadn't escalated the way it did. I'm not proud of letting my anger slip. But the kiss. She held up a hand, stilling him with a slight gesture. "We don't have to figure it all out this second. You were caught in a moment of raw emotion, and I was, too. Let's get through this situation with the sculpture first, and then, maybe we can talk, calmly, about what it means." A flicker of relief crossed his face, though an undercurrent of longing still smoldered there. "That's fair," he agreed. "One crisis at a time." They rode the elevator down to the lobby in silence, standing close but careful not to touch. Outside, the city's hustle and bustle returned with full force, car horns, pedestrians rushing by, the aroma of food carts drifting in the air. Emberly felt the momentary sense of calm she'd had upstairs dissolve, replaced by the everyday reality of life in Manhattan. She sensed that Lincoln felt it, too. As they parted ways on the sidewalk, with Emberly flagging a taxi and Lincoln stepping into his waiting sedan, she couldn't help reflecting on how much had changed in such a short period. They had gone from mere strangers sharing polite art conversations to two people bound by a confusing and powerful spark that neither fully understood. The future of the driftwood sculpture hung in the balance, and maybe so did the future of whatever existed between them. Yet as Emberly settled into the back seat of her taxi, staring out at the passing skyscrapers, she found herself smiling faintly. Despite the turmoil and the missteps, the passion that ignited around art and around each other felt undeniably real. Whether it would burn them both or lead to something more profound was a question no one could answer yet, but she realized, with a trembling kind of acceptance, that she wasn't afraid to find out. Emberly spent the next several days balancing on a precarious edge between cautious optimism and growing anxiety. The night's tension with Lincoln still haunted her thoughts, hovering in the background like an echo that refused to fade. Yet, at the same time, she couldn't forget how they had managed to present a united front in the meeting with the artist's representative, speaking from the same place of genuine respect for the driftwood sculpture. That combination of personal tumult and shared focus on art made for a strange, delicate dance, a series of steps forward and backward, neither of them quite sure where they would land. In the mornings, she continued her usual duties at the gallery, greeting visitors and assisting Cassiopeia with upcoming show preparations. Every so often, she would glance at her phone, half hoping and half fearing an update from Lincoln. By midday, she would need to step away from the front desk to check her messages, her stomach twisting if there was no word. Cassiopeia, noticing Emberly's uncharacteristic distraction, cornered her after lunch on a Wednesday to demand an explanation. "So," Cassiopeia said, leaning against Emberly's office doorway with her arms crossed, "I've heard whispers that something dramatic went down at the auction. Someone said you and Mr. Slade had a disagreement. Then, poof, you both disappeared. Care to fill me in before I have to rely on the rumor mill?" Emberly's heart lurched. She knew rumors in the art world spread fast, often warped by speculation. Taking a breath to steady herself, she recounted the evening in careful, edited detail, mentioning Lincoln's frustration and the scene in which he confronted the intermediary. She left out the more explosive specifics, the sharp slap, the unexpected kiss. Even so, Cassiopeia's eyes widened in alarm. "That's quite an event," her boss said softly, drumming her fingers against the doorframe. "I'm guessing Sawyer was involved. He's known for provoking strong reactions. But I didn't think Lincoln Slade was the type to lose his temper." She paused, studying Emberly's face. "Are you sure you're all right?" Emberly forced a small, tight smile. "I'm fine. Things got heated, but we're sorting it out. The main point is that Lincoln's still intent on acquiring that sculpture. He's meeting with the artist's representative again when they decide, and I'm helping him refine his proposal." Cassiopeia was silent for a moment, her gaze sharp. "And the two of you, professionally, are still good?" Emberly nodded more confidently than she felt. "Yes. Absolutely. It's just a tense process, you know how these high-stakes acquisitions go. Once this is resolved, I'm sure things will settle down." Cassiopeia didn't look entirely convinced, but she let it drop, instructing Emberly to keep her updated on any developments. That was the closest Emberly came to telling anyone at the gallery about the private storm roiling between her and Lincoln. Part of her wanted to confide in someone, her colleague or friend Zadie, perhaps, but she couldn't bring herself to risk letting the story spiral out of her control. When Wednesday evening rolled around with no news, Emberly found herself idly organizing the back storeroom long after closing time. She told herself it was to keep busy, to be productive, but in truth, she was trying to drown out the hum of unanswered questions about Lincoln, and, if she were honest, about her own heart. Her mind drifted to the memory of his sudden kiss, the shock and fierce hunger in his eyes. She wanted to both banish that memory and cling to it, conflicting urges that left her drained. On Thursday, just as she was about to lock up for the night, her phone rang. She nearly dropped a stack of art brochures in her scramble to answer. Lincoln's voice on the other end sounded as taut as a pulled wire. "I just heard from Regina," he said. "The artist is close to making a decision. She's asked for one more conversation, an online video call, set for tomorrow afternoon. Will you join me?" Emberly's pulse quickened. "Of course. Just text me the details, time, place, whatever you need." He exhaled in relief. "Thank you. It'll be at my penthouse office tomorrow at 3. Regina said the artist herself might actually be present via video, which is rare. So we need to be prepared for anything." The following day, Emberly arrived at Lincoln's high-rise building just before 3. She'd been there once before, she remembered the sleek architecture and polished marble lobby. This time, she was greeted by a discreetly stationed assistant who escorted her up to Lincoln's private office on one of the top floors. The space was large but surprisingly inviting, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a careful arrangement of modern art that Emberly recognized from various galleries. Despite her swirling nerves, she felt an undercurrent of admiration at how tastefully Lincoln had curated his environment. He wasn't just a wealthy collector, he truly lived and breathed the pieces he surrounded himself with. Lincoln was waiting for her by a sleek glass conference table, his expression somber yet determined. He motioned for her to take a seat beside him. Regina was already on the screen, greeting them with a curt nod. They exchanged pleasantries, and then a shadowy figure joined the video call, a woman whose camera was angled away from her face, revealing only a glimpse of slender hands and part of an easel behind her. Emberly guessed this must be the reclusive sculptor, who apparently took privacy so seriously that she rarely even showed her face online. "I suppose you want to hear my final decision," the woman said, her voice warm but guarded. "I've seen your questionnaire answers, Mr. Slade. I've listened to Regina's observations. And I must say, your determination stands out, both positively and negatively. There's a fine line between genuine passion and possession for possession's sake." Lincoln spoke with measured calm. "I know I came across too forceful at the auction. For that, I apologize. But my passion for your sculpture is real. I'm not just buying an object, I'm investing in a vision of human connection. Your piece represents something I've been searching for in my own life, two halves bound by something that transcends division." Emberly noticed he was choosing his words more carefully than she'd ever seen. She offered a slight nod of encouragement, then added, "I've watched Lincoln interact with artists and artworks. He doesn't simply collect them for vanity. He honors them. That's why I've been willing to help throughout this entire process. He's sincere." There was a moment of quiet on the call, filled only by the subdued hum of ambient city noise. Finally, the woman on the other end let out a small sigh. "You're convincing, both of you. But I have some conditions if I decide to proceed. One is that the piece must be loaned out to at least one public museum exhibit each year, so it can be experienced by those who can't afford private gallery tours. The second is that you'll agree never to resell it at auction. If for some reason you can't keep it, it reverts to my discretion." Lincoln nodded immediately. "Agreed, on both counts." Emberly watched the faint movement on the screen, a slight tilt, as though the sculptor were appraising them from behind her hidden vantage point. "Then we have an understanding. Regina will handle the contract details. I'll trust you to keep your word and ensure my creation isn't locked away in a silent vault." The tension in Lincoln's shoulders melted. He exhaled, relief shining in his eyes. "Thank you. I promise I won't let you down." The call ended with curt goodbyes, Regina explaining she would email the final paperwork by the end of the day. As the screen darkened, Emberly realized she'd been gripping the table's edge so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked over at Lincoln, who turned to her with a shaky laugh. "We did it," he said. "It's actually happening." She's agreed. "You did it," Emberly corrected, smiling. "Your honesty won her over in the end." Lincoln's gaze flickered with an emotion she could only describe as relief mingled with gratitude. "I couldn't have gotten here without you. You were the bridge that made her see I'm not just waving a checkbook around." They stood almost in unison, as though an electric current had passed between them. There was no one else in the office now. Lincoln's assistant had quietly excused herself once the call began. Warm afternoon light streamed through the panoramic windows, illuminating particles of dust dancing in the air. "It feels strange," Lincoln murmured, stepping closer to the windows. "I've wanted that sculpture for weeks, yet it was never just about owning it. It was about understanding something inside myself that I've been wrestling with for a long time." Emberly approached, leaving just a step or two of space between them. "That's how the best art speaks to us, isn't it? It shows us a reflection we can't ignore." He turned to face her. In the daylight, every nuance of his expression was laid bare. She saw gratitude, admiration, and a lingering rawness that spoke of the tension still simmering beneath the surface. For a moment, she thought he might mention the slap, the kiss, all the chaotic emotions they'd unleashed. But instead, he reached out and gently slid his hand along her forearm, his fingertips brushing the sleeve of her blouse. "Emberly. I meant what I said the other night. I wasn't just angry or panicked. Something in me reached for you because he paused, searching for the right words. I care about you. And I'm not used to caring about someone who isn't already part of my carefully constructed world. Her breath caught in her throat. She recalled the heat in his eyes at the auction, how that same fervor had erupted into a clash of palms and lips. But now, in the quiet hush of his penthouse office, there was a gentleness that tugged at her heart. She thought about all the lines she had vowed not to cross. He was a client, a billionaire whose life was separated from hers by more than just money. Yet here they stood, the air between them humming with unspoken possibilities. She swallowed, forcing herself to speak carefully. I care about you too. But it's complicated. The whole reason we met was because of this collection, and we still haven't even figured out how to handle that professionally once it's complete. And, she hesitated, remembering the sting of her palm against his cheek. And we've already hurt each other, even if it was unintentional. Lincoln gently rotated his hand to clasp hers, his grip warm and assured. I know. But I also know that if we don't at least talk about this, we'll regret it. Maybe we can't solve everything today, but we should at least acknowledge that it's real. I don't want to hide behind polite silence anymore. Her heart beat so loudly she wondered if he could hear it. Where do we start? She asked quietly. He glanced around at the sunlit office, the beautiful art on the walls, and the city skyline beyond. Maybe we start by sharing one evening, he suggested. No auctions, no frantic negotiations, just us. Dinner. A walk along the river. Something normal, where we can talk without the weight of this deal looming over us. It sounded both wonderfully simple and terrifying. Her mind raced with a dozen reasons to hesitate, but the memory of how passionately he pursued art, and the way he seemed equally intent on pursuing her, overpowered her doubts. She nodded, a slight smile tugging at her lips. All right, she agreed. One evening. But let's promise that no matter what happens, we keep art at the center of it. That's what brought us together in the first place. Relief softened his features. I promise. I know a gallery opening next week, a small venue, up-and-coming artists. We can go there first, then find somewhere quiet to eat and talk. She gave his hand a reassuring squeeze before pulling away gently. It felt like the first step on uncharted ground, a step that could lead to something extraordinary or end in heartbreak. As she gathered her bag and prepared to leave, she realized she was no longer trembling from nerves, a sense of cautious hope steadied her. Lincoln walked her to the private elevator, punching in a security code before the doors slid open. As she stepped inside, he held her gaze. Thank you again, he said, voice hushed. For everything. She was reminded of the first time she'd seen him in the gallery, just another VIP visitor whose name she didn't know. Now, it felt as though they'd journeyed an entire lifetime since that moment. Congratulations on acquiring the sculpture, she said softly. And, for whatever it's worth, I'm proud of you for the way you handled things in the end. He managed a faint laugh, tinged with gratitude. Couldn't have done it without you. The elevator doors closed, and Emberly found herself descending toward the bustling city streets, the hum of machinery a quiet backdrop to her swirling thoughts. She felt as though she'd crossed a new threshold, personally, emotionally, and even professionally. The lines that had once separated her world from Lincoln's had blurred, tangled, and reformed in ways she would have never predicted. And yet she was no longer afraid of that tangled space. She felt a tentative sense of readiness to see what lay ahead. By the time she emerged onto the busy sidewalk, her phone chimed with an email notification from Regina, confirming a final contract draft. She smiled to herself, weaving through the crowds with a lighter step than she'd had in weeks. The driftwood sculpture was theirs. But there was another question, infinitely more complex, that lingered on her mind. If she and Lincoln could find harmony in their shared love of art, might they also find a way to mend the tension, and harness the spark that flared between them at the auction? As she walked past towering skyscrapers and neon-lit storefronts, she realized she was no longer content to let that question remain unanswered. One evening. One chance to learn if the tapestry of emotions woven between them could become something real. The thought made her heart flutter with anticipation and, for the first time in days, a calm sense of possibility. The following week passed in a tense, excited blur for Emberly. She immersed herself in planning the gallery's next exhibit, all the while keenly aware of the approaching evening she and Lincoln had agreed upon. Each morning, she arrived early at the gallery to set up new pieces, chat with Cassiopeia about upcoming promotions, and respond to inquiries from local art circles. In quiet moments, however, she found her thoughts straying to the memory of Lincoln's voice, his intense gaze, and the possibility that the undercurrent between them might blossom into something real. Finally, the day arrived. Emberly wrapped up her tasks at the gallery by late afternoon and slipped into the back office to freshen up. She swapped her usual black flats for low-heeled ankle boots and exchanged her paint-speckled apron for a simple yet elegant dark wrap dress that felt comfortable but refined. Brushing a hint of blush onto her cheeks, she told herself to breathe. This was just an evening, an extension of a connection that had been forming for weeks. Yet every nerve in her body hummed with anticipation. When she stepped onto the sidewalk outside the gallery, the city's early evening glow enveloped her. Street lamps were already flickering on, and the bustle of traffic provided a steady soundtrack. She caught sight of a familiar, sleek town car idling at the curb, and as she approached, the back door opened. Lincoln emerged, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that managed to look both formal and relaxed, a subtle nod to the evening's mixture of art and personal time. "Hey," he said softly, a small, earnest smile tugging at his lips. "Ready?" She nodded, heart fluttering at the warmth in his gaze. "Ready." They climbed into the car, and soon they were weaving through congested Manhattan streets until they arrived at a modest, unassuming building. A discreet sign over the door read Perigee Studio. It was a newly opened gallery that Emberly had heard about only in passing. She'd been meaning to visit but hadn't had the time. A hush fell over her thoughts as she climbed the steps, feeling a thrill at the notion of sharing an art experience with Lincoln without the pressure of a high-stakes acquisition. Inside, low lighting accentuated a series of bold, modern sculptures placed on pedestals of varying heights. The air carried the faint scent of fresh paint and newly plastered walls, hallmark signs of a space still finding its footing in the art world. A few dozen guests roamed between installations, quietly murmuring opinions. Emberly felt her pulse steady as she stepped forward, drawn by the first piece, a sweeping, curved metallic form that glinted under the gallery lights. Lincoln lingered beside her, his attention just as focused on the sculptures. They slipped into a natural rhythm, discussing each piece in whispers. One sculpture featured interlocking spheres that looked like a model of a molecular structure, another was a series of twisted steel rods that somehow suggested a dancer frozen mid-twirl. Emberly appreciated how each creation invited a conversation between them, words that might have been difficult to say without the neutral ground of art to guide them. Eventually, they reached the largest piece, set in the center of the gallery. It was a multimedia installation of painted driftwood, neon tubes, and shards of translucent fabric. The effect was mesmerizing. Light refracted through the fabric, casting soft, tinted shadows on the walls, while the driftwood's rough texture spoke to natural resilience. Emberly drew closer, running her fingertips across a small plaque that identified the artist. "This is incredible," she breathed, circling the sculpture with slow, deliberate steps. "It's like watching nature, technology, and raw creativity collide." Lincoln's expression was thoughtful. "It reminds me, in a way, of the piece we just acquired, a sense of two worlds merging." But here, the artist took it further, adding man-made light to the organic form. Emberly paused, letting the gentle glow wash over her. "It's a reminder that sometimes the best results come from blending the unexpected," she murmured. "Whether that's materials in art or people who never thought they'd connect." A flicker of a smile tugged at Lincoln's mouth. She could almost feel the heat of his gaze on her profile. "Are we the unexpected materials in this analogy?" She lowered her eyes, but she didn't deny it. "Maybe we are." He leaned in slightly, close enough that she caught the faint spice of his cologne. And what do you think happens when two worlds collide? He asked, a note of gentle challenge in his tone. Emberly hesitated, recalling their fiery clash at the auction, the abrupt slap and kiss. I think it can be painful, she admitted softly. But sometimes it creates something beautiful. They shared a long moment of quiet that felt more intimate than any conversation they'd had so far. Then, as if guided by mutual agreement, they moved on to the smaller side gallery, where vibrant paintings of cityscapes filled one wall. Eventually, they wandered back to the entrance, where an older man in a worn corduroy blazer tapped a microphone to announce the evening's spoken-word segment. Emberly and Lincoln slipped out just before the performance began, not wanting to interrupt the hush that was settling over the crowd. They still had their own conversation to finish elsewhere. Outside, the evening air carried a crispness hinting at autumn's approach. Lincoln suggested they walk instead of calling the driver, and Emberly gladly agreed. Shoulder to shoulder, they ambled along a less crowded avenue, the noise of taxis and late commuters a comforting hum in the background. At an unassuming bistro with a tiny front patio, they found a table by the window. Laughter from other patrons mingled with the clink of glassware, creating a cozy atmosphere. Over plates of roasted vegetables and seared fish, they talked more openly than ever before. Emberly admitted her fear that stepping into Lincoln's circle, his world of constant scrutiny, money, and power plays, might swallow up the person she was. Lincoln confessed he had spent years holding others at arm's length, uncertain if they cared for him or his fortune. He'd buried his genuine passions beneath a smooth facade, letting only glimpses of his real self emerge through art. When the conversation turned to the slap and the searing kiss they'd shared, Emberly's cheeks warmed. She fidgeted with the napkin on her lap, unsure how to begin. Lincoln, noticing her discomfort, reached across the small table to gently still her hand. That night at the auction, he began, voice low, I felt cornered, by Sawyer, by the sense that I was about to lose not just the sculpture, but something I didn't even fully understand. I lashed out. And I suppose you, well, you lashed out, too. She breathed a shaky laugh. That's a polite way to put it. I'm not proud I slapped you. His thumb stroked small circles on the back of her hand. I'm not proud I provoked you. But maybe we needed that jolt to realize there was something more between us, something neither of us wanted to admit or ruin. Emberly studied his hand, letting her fingers close around his. Then, in a strange way, I'm almost grateful it happened. It was raw and messy, but it showed how strongly we affect each other. He squeezed her hand in agreement, and for a moment, no further words were necessary. The world outside the bistro receded, leaving them in a soft cocoon of shared vulnerability. By the time they finished eating, Emberly felt a renewed sense of buoyancy, like she had exhaled a burden she didn't know she was carrying. The sky had grown darker when they stepped back onto the street. Neon lights gleamed on wet pavement. Somewhere along the way, the clouds must have released a quick drizzle. Lincoln suggested they hail a cab, but Emberly wasn't ready to end the night yet. Instead, they meandered toward the waterfront, drawn by the promise of starlight and a breeze off the Hudson River. Under the glow of tall street lamps along the promenade, they slowed to a stop near a railing overlooking the water. The distant shimmer of city lights reflected across the dark surface. Emberly inhaled the scent of river air, cool and tinged with a faint saltiness. Lincoln stood at her side, silent for a long moment, as if absorbing the night's serenity. What happens now? She finally asked, voicing the question that had been hovering for days. You've got your dream piece for the collection, and we'll work on installing it in your home. But beyond that, where do we go from here? He turned, resting an elbow on the railing to face her. A gentle wind ruffled his hair, and in the soft illumination of a nearby lamp, his expression was as open as she'd ever seen. I don't know every detail, he said honestly. But I do know I want you in my life, Emberly, if that's what you want, too. Not just as someone who curates my art, but as someone who sees me for who I really am. Her pulse fluttered. She found herself recalling the swirl of paint, the metal arcs, the driftwood sculpture, art that was always about transformation and the intertwining of two seeming opposites. She knew she and Lincoln came from different worlds, but those worlds had brought them together in a way that felt both improbable and undeniably genuine. She lifted her gaze to meet his. "I want that, too," she admitted softly. "But I won't pretend I'm not nervous. The gossip, the expectations, the possibility that maybe we'll collide again the way we did at the auction." His hand moved to gently cup her cheek. "We probably will collide. Art and life are chaotic. People clash, they push each other's boundaries. But that's part of growth, isn't it?" A surge of tenderness swelled in Emberly's chest. She recalled how, at the very beginning, she'd been impressed by his ability to see beyond a sculpture's surface. Now, he was applying that same insight to their relationship, understanding that imperfections and potential pain were as much a part of love as passion and hope. In the soft glow of the waterfront lights, she rose onto her toes, pressing her lips to his. This kiss was different from the one born of anger. It was slow, reverent, a conversation spoken in breath and warmth. The tension that once flared with violence was now soothed into something gentle yet powerful, a promise that they would try, even if it meant risking more heartbreak. When they pulled apart, he drew her close, wrapping an arm around her waist as they stared out over the water. The hum of the city felt distant compared to the quiet thud of their hearts. Eventually, practical matters intruded, as they always did. They found a taxi willing to drive them back into the heart of Manhattan. During the ride, Emberly rested her head on Lincoln's shoulder, marveling at how comfortable the moment felt, even though she knew they still had many things to navigate: his rivalry with Sawyer, her responsibilities at the gallery, the inevitable gossip that would spark once people caught wind of their relationship. But for the first time, none of that felt insurmountable. They had confronted their worst impulses once before and emerged with a new kind of bond. At her apartment building, Lincoln insisted on walking her to the door. Beneath the porch light's muted glow, he brushed a final kiss across her temple, then stepped back with a faint, contented smile. "We'll figure it out," he said, and Emberly nodded. In that simple statement, she heard the promise of tomorrow, a continuation of the enthralling, messy, and undeniably meaningful story they'd begun. She watched him head down the steps, hands tucked into his pockets as the night air ruffled his jacket. Something about the unassuming curve of his shoulders reminded her that beneath all his wealth and power, he was still a man who had risked his heart on an unlikely connection. She lingered there until his silhouette disappeared into the waiting car, then finally turned to unlock her door. The apartment felt unusually warm and bright, as if reflecting her own inner glow. Emberly leaned against the closed door for a moment, hugging her purse to her chest. This might not be the ending of their story, far from it, but it was the beginning of something she had once believed existed only in the realm of romantic daydreams. She set her purse aside and let herself imagine the days ahead, installing the driftwood sculpture in Lincoln's home, perhaps unveiling it in a small, exclusive gathering, and exploring the possibility that they could be more than an impulsive moment of passion. As she moved through her living room, flipping off lamps and tidying up, a sudden image flickered in her mind: the sculpture they'd acquired, two halves of a figure eternally joined by a hidden grain of wood. She thought of how, in the right light, every flaw became part of a grander design, each twist and knot lending beauty and resilience. Maybe that was what lay at the heart of her and Lincoln's connection, an alliance of two distinct worlds, joined at the seams by the power of art and the undeniable pull of genuine emotion. In the hush of the midnight hour, Emberly allowed herself a small, hopeful smile. The city outside her window sparkled with endless possibilities, and for the first time in a long while, she believed she was ready for whatever came next. The collisions, the challenges, the passion, and the art, it was all part of a single, evolving canvas she and Lincoln would continue painting, one daring brushstroke at a time.